Walk the crest of the Saddle Dam on a quiet morning, and the first thing you notice is the sound. Not the roar you'd expect from a structure holding back 66 billion cubic meters of water. Something softer, a wet exhale, water trickling where concrete meets rock, finding joints, working through seams that should be sealed. Look down toward the downstream toe and you see it, dark patches on the ground that weren't there 2 years ago. Pools forming in depressions along the base, not rainwater, not runoff. This water is coming from inside the dam. A herder who grazes cattle along the ridge below has watched these wet patches spread season by season since the reservoir reached full pool. He doesn't know the engineering term for what he's seeing, he just knows the ground used to be dry. This is the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, Africa's largest, $5 billion, inaugurated 5 months ago as a monument to a continent's sovereignty. 13 turbines, 74 billion cubic meters of Blue Nile water, and a 5-kilometer saddle dam that satellite radar now shows is sinking unevenly. 40 millimeters of differential settlement, 4 to 8 times the acceptable limit, while an estimated 41 billion cubic meters of that reservoir has bled into the fractured rock beneath it. The engineers flagged every one of these problems 13 years ago. The dam was built anyway, partly by a military corporation, later convicted of stealing billions. Its chief engineer was found dead with a bullet wound 1 month before the corruption was exposed. And downstream, 20 million people live in the flood path of a structure that has never had an independent safety inspection made public. This is the engineering story behind the headlines, and the clock is still running. To understand how a $5 billion dam ends up leaking water into the earth almost as fast as it stores it, you need to understand 2 things. First, how the dam was built. And second, the one structural component that nobody talks about, the component that holds back 89% of the reservoir and sits on the worst possible geology. The story starts in 1956 when American engineers from the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation first surveyed the Blue Nile Gorge and identified this site as a potential dam location. For 50 years, the site sat dormant. Then, on April 2, 2011, Prime Minister Meles Zenawi laid the foundation stone and announced that Ethiopia would build the dam itself, financed almost entirely with domestic money, government bonds, payroll deductions from civil servants, public donations passed through churches and community halls. Roughly $1 billion came from China's Exim Bank for electrical equipment. The rest, nearly $4 billion, came from the Ethiopian people. The construction contract went to Italian firm Salini Impregilo, now called WeBuild. No competitive bidding, no independent engineering review before construction began. The project broke ground before anyone outside the design team had evaluated whether the site could safely hold what Ethiopia planned to put there. And what they planned to put there was enormous. The main dam is a roller-compacted concrete gravity structure, RCC, the standard method for large dams where concrete is placed in layers and compacted with heavy rollers. Workers poured 10.2 million cubic meters of RCC into that gorge. On December 28, 2014, they set a world record, 23,000 cubic meters placed in a single 24-hour shift. The dam stretches 1,780 meters across the gorge, anchored to hard bedrock on both sides. The reservoir filled in 5 phases across successive rainy seasons. First filling hit 540 meters in July 2020. The 5th and final filling reached the full supply level of 640 meters above sea level in October 2024. As of early 2026, 6 of 13 turbines are spinning. The rest are being commissioned. On paper, it sounds like a triumph. The largest dam in Africa, built by Africans, paid for by Africans, generating power for a nation where more than half the population still lacks reliable electricity. But here's where the engineering diverges from the press releases. The main dam, the one you see in photographs, the massive concrete wall across the gorge, is not the structure that keeps researchers awake at night. The structure they're worried about is 10 kilometers to the northwest, where the terrain dips to a low point along the reservoir's rim. That low point is a problem. Without something blocking it, the reservoir would simply flow over the ridge and drain. The something blocking it is called the saddle dam. And this is where you need to pay close attention, because the saddle dam is the single most important and least discussed component of the entire GERD system. A saddle dam is a secondary dam built across a topographic low point, a saddle in the terrain surrounding a reservoir. It's not glamorous. It doesn't generate electricity. It doesn't have turbines or spillways or control gates. Its only job is to keep the water in. GERD's saddle dam is a concrete-faced rockfill structure, meaning it's a massive pile of compacted rock with a concrete face on the upstream side to prevent water from seeping through. It stands approximately 50 meters tall, and it stretches 5 kilometers long. 5 kilometers. That's not a dam in the way most people picture one. That's a wall running across a landscape for the length of 60 football fields. This single structure holds back 89% of the reservoir's live storage. Read that again. The main dam, the 145-meter concrete giant, retains only 11%. The saddle dam retains the rest. It has no spillway, no bottom outlets, no mechanism whatsoever for controlled water release. If something goes wrong with this structure, there is no valve to turn. And here is the engineering problem that changes everything. The saddle dam sits on a completely different geological foundation than the main dam. The main dam is anchored to hard bedrock in the gorge, competent rock that can bear enormous loads. The saddle dam sits on weathered rock riddled with fault zones, fractured, faulted, folded Neoproterozoic basement, geological terminology for rock that has been broken and shifted by tectonic forces over hundreds of millions of years. Think of it as the difference between building on granite and building on a cracked dinner plate. That cracked dinner plate is now holding back 66 billion cubic meters of water. The first people to formally flag this risk were the International Panel of Experts, the IPOE, convened in 2012, a full year after construction had already started. 10 experts, 2 from Ethiopia, 2 from Egypt, 2 from Sudan, and 4 independent internationals. Their report, issued May 31, 2013, was signed unanimously. It was never officially released. International Rivers obtained a leaked copy in March 2014. The panel's findings were devastating. They called the hydrological study very basic and not yet at a level of detail, sophistication, and reliability that would befit a development of this magnitude. They warned that shear strength parameters, the values used to calculate how much force the rock can resist before it slides, were too optimistic. And they specifically flagged the risk of hazardous seepage through the saddle dam's fractured foundation and warned of potential differential settlement. Differential settlement, when one part of a foundation sinks faster than another, creating internal stresses that can crack a structure apart. The IPOE warned about it in 2013. Satellite data confirmed it in 2026. 13 years. The warning sat there for 13 years. Now let's look at what those satellites actually found, because the numbers are staggering. The February 2026 Chapman/Yale study used 4 separate remote sensing technologies: Sentinel-1 radar interferometry, which measures ground deformation to millimeter precision by bouncing radar signals off the same points over time; GRACE satellite gravity data, which detects mass changes in the Earth by measuring tiny shifts in gravitational pull; Worldview 3 optical imagery; and hydrological modeling calibrated against all 3. The radar data detected 40 millimeters of differential settlement on the saddle dam, 40 millimeters. To put that in context, the acceptable tolerance for a concrete-faced rock-filled dam on competent foundations is typically 5 to 10 millimeters. This structure is showing 4 to 8 times that limit, and the settlement is non-uniform, meaning different sections are sinking at different rates. An earlier 2021 study by the same team had already identified 7 critical nodes on the saddle dam that correspond to tectonic faults beneath the structure. Adjacent nodes showed opposing displacement trends, some sections subsiding while their neighbors experienced uplift. That's not normal consolidation. That's the geology moving underneath the dam. At the main dam, displacements ranged from 10 to 90 millimeters, concentrated on the western extremity. But the main dam sits on hard rock and is built from reinforced concrete designed to handle stress. The Saddle Dam is rockfill on fractured geology. It has far less tolerance for movement. Now, layer the seepage data on top of that, because this is where the picture turns from concerning to alarming. A July 2024 study published in PNAS Nexus, researchers from Western Michigan University, Arizona State, and Argonne National Lab used GRACE satellite gravity data to track where the reservoir's water was actually going. They estimated seepage at 19.8 billion cubic meters, plus or minus 6 billion, from 2019 to 2022 alone. That's roughly equal to the total volume the reservoir impounded during the same period. The dam was storing water, and the Earth was drinking it almost as fast. The 2026 Chapman/Yale paper extended this analysis through 2024 and arrived at a cumulative estimate of 41 billion cubic meters of groundwater infiltration over the entire filling period. 41 billion cubic meters. For comparison, the entire reservoir holds 74 billion at full capacity. More than half the reservoir's volume has migrated into the subsurface. Where is it going? The GRACE data tracked a mass anomaly of 43 billion cubic meters migrating south-southwest along mapped fault structures, traveling roughly 300 kilometers from the dam site. Previously unobserved marshes began appearing in lowland areas near South Sudan, starting in 2020. Water that was supposed to be generating electricity is instead following ancient fracture networks deep underground, surfacing hundreds of kilometers away. High-resolution satellite imagery also detected new water zones near the Saddle Dam itself, ponds, and saturated areas that did not exist before filling began, aligned precisely with fault networks. The study's authors called for immediate structural inspection. Now, compare this to how the world's best-built dams handle seepage. China's Three Gorges Dam, 181 meters tall, 22,500 megawatts, sits on granite, where engineers identified crack systems with 83% connectivity on potential slide surfaces. They responded with deep grouting, high-pressure cement, epoxy resin in fault zones, acrylate enhancement for impermeability, plus an extensive drainage gallery system. Total seepage through Three Gorges measures 614 liters per minute. All within design parameters. GERD's Saddle Dam has lost 41 billion cubic meters to the subsurface over 4 years. That is not a comparison of degree, that is a comparison of kind. Itaipu Dam on the Brazil-Paraguay border, 196 meters tall, 14,000 megawatts, was designed with 2,218 monitoring instruments. 856 of those are embedded in the foundation alone. Piezometers measuring water pressure in the rock, extensometers tracking movement, stress meters, pendulums, thermometers, joint meters, all feeding an automated alert system that has operated continuously since the dam was commissioned. GERD's monitoring instrumentation details remain undisclosed. Hoover Dam, built in the 1930s, pioneered adaptive foundation treatment. When initial grouting proved incomplete in 58 of 393 holes, engineers drilled new holes from internal inspection galleries and remediated every one. A 3-row grout curtain extends from rim to rim. When a 1992 safety evaluation identified potential seismic deficiencies, world-class experts conducted advanced nonlinear dynamic analysis. The Bureau of Reclamation still monitors Hoover after nearly 90 years of service. What GERD's Saddle Dam required, at minimum, given its 5-kilometer length over fractured terrain with known fault crossings, deep multi-row grout curtains penetrating through all permeable zones, a continuous impervious barrier, comprehensive drainage with monitoring weirs, a dense network of foundation piezometers and extensometers, and a baseline seismic monitoring network operational before filling began. Whether any of this was done to international standards is publicly unverifiable. Ethiopia has not released the data. The IPOE recommended studies were never completed, and the construction history of the dam's most critical components involves an organization that makes the question of quality not just relevant, but urgent, because the electromechanical systems, the hydraulic steel structures, the turbine generators, and the transmission equipment for this dam were not built by Webuild. They were built by a military corporation that had never seen a dam in its life. And what happened with that corporation and the billions of dollars that vanished is a story that makes the engineering problems look almost predictable. In 2010, the Ethiopian government created an entity called METEC, the Metals and Engineering Corporation. On paper, it was an industrial conglomerate. In practice, it was a military enterprise controlled by the ruling TPLF coalition and headed by Major General Kinfe Dagnu. METEC manufactured military equipment. It had never built a dam. It had never installed a turbine. It had no experience in hydraulic steel structures, electromechanical systems, or high-voltage transmission infrastructure. In 2011, METEC was awarded an $853 million contract for the most technically complex work on the GERD. The electromechanical systems, hydraulic steel structures, turbine generators, and 500 kilovolt transmission equipment. The components that convert stored water into usable electricity. The components that, if built improperly, compromise the dam's ability to manage water flow safely. Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed later said it plainly. We handed over a complicated water dam project to people who have not seen a dam in their lives. By 2018, 7 years into the contract, METEC had consumed 65% of its payment, 16.7 billion birr. The work completed, 23%. Bottom outlets, the structures that allow controlled water release during emergencies, were found to be below quality requirements. Steelwork had to be ripped out and replaced. Materials installed throughout the project had what auditors called defective and dimensional problems. The externalities from METEC's failed work cost an estimated 460 million euros in remediation and delays. A state television documentary later revealed what happened to the money. Of the 16.7 billion birr paid to METEC, only 266 million remained in the corporation's bank accounts. The rest, more than 98%, was gone. Prime Minister Abiy fired METEC from the GERD project in August 2018. What followed was one of the largest corruption investigations in Ethiopian history. General Kinfe Dagnu was arrested at the Sudanese border, attempting to flee the country. He was convicted of corruption. More than 60 people were arrested, including 36 intelligence officers embedded within METEC's operations. Ethiopia's Audit Service Corporation conducted an external audit and found that 65 billion birr, over $2 billion, had vanished without a trace over a decade. Ambassador Suleiman Dedefo, the CEO of METEC's successor entity, stated publicly that the missing money could have built another GERD. International procurement, totaling approximately $2 billion, had been conducted without any bidding processes. Prices were inflated up to 400 times actual cost. Think about what that means. A component worth $10,000 was purchased for $4 million, and it was installed inside a dam holding 74 billion cubic meters of water. 7 foreign contractors had to be brought in to replace METEC. Voith Hydro, GE Hydro France, Sinohydro, and others. The replacement work added an estimated 4 years to the construction schedule. Those contractors fixed what they could. But the question that lingers is what they couldn't see. The bottom outlets were visibly defective and got replaced. The steelwork with dimensional problems was ripped out. But what about the work that's embedded inside the structure? What about the components you can't inspect without taking the dam apart? Nobody has publicly answered that question. And then there is the death of the man who knew the most. Semegnu Bekele was the chief engineer of the GERD from its inception. He was the project's public face, the person who briefed journalists, defended timelines, and managed the technical reality of constructing the largest dam in Africa. On the morning of July 26, 2018, Bekele left his home carrying a plane ticket and a packed bag for the dam site. He was scheduled to brief reporters on construction status that day. He never arrived. He was found dead from a gunshot wound in his vehicle at Meskel Square in central Addis Ababa. 1 month before Metek was fired, police ruled it suicide. His family rejected the finding. Mass protests erupted across the country demanding justice. His death remains unexplained. The man who knew exactly what Metek had built and what it had failed to build is gone. So here is where we stand. A 5-kilometer saddle dam holding 89% of the reservoir's live storage, sitting on fractured geology, showing 40 millimeters of differential settlement, losing tens of billions of cubic meters to underground seepage along fault lines. Built partly by a military corporation whose leadership was convicted of stealing billions. With a chief engineer dead under unexplained circumstances, with the independent safety studies recommended 13 years ago never completed, and with all internal monitoring data classified. The IPOE said in 2013, conduct comprehensive structural studies. A working group at MIT the following year warned that saddle dam risks were underappreciated and that failure would be catastrophic for Sudan. Professor Asfaw Bayan of San Diego State went further, arguing publicly that the dam was 300% oversized and that political pressure was suppressing legitimate engineering inputs. None of the recommended studies were finished. A French firm, BRLI, was hired to conduct them. Negotiations over terms of reference collapsed. 5 years of talks produced nothing. The dam was completed and filled without independent verification. Ethiopia maintains the dam meets international standards. WebBuild says an extensive real-time monitoring system tracks every movement with sensors and pendulums. That may be true, but the data has never been shared publicly, and the researchers who wrote The World's Largest Saddle Dam at Risk were working from satellites because they had no other option. Now let's talk about what happens if those satellites are right. What you're about to hear is not speculation. These are the numbers from multiple peer-reviewed dam breach studies, published in journals including the International Journal of Disaster Risk Reduction, Applied Water Science, and MDPI's Water, using HECRAS two-dimensional modeling, calibrated against the known geometry of the Blue Nile Channel and the downstream dam cascade. These are the projections the engineers calculated. This is what the physics says happens. The saddle dam fails, not the main dam, the 5-kilometer rockfill structure 10 kilometers to the northwest. It does not need to collapse entirely. A progressive breach through a weakened fault zone is sufficient. The reservoir begins draining through the breach point. 66 billion cubic meters of water, 89% of live storage, enters the Blue Nile Gorge. Peak breach discharge, 162,248 cubic meters per second. For context, the average flow of the entire Mississippi River is roughly 16,500 cubic meters per second. This breach discharge is 10 times the Mississippi. 120 kilometers downstream sits Rosaire's Dam, 78 meters tall, 7.4 billion cubic meters of storage. The flood wave arrives in 3 to 5 hours. That is not enough time for meaningful emergency operations. Every study that models this scenario reaches the same conclusion. Rosaire is overtopped by approximately 11 meters. A dam designed to hold back a reservoir is now submerged under 11 meters of water pouring over its crest. It collapses. Its 7.4 billion cubic meters join the flood, 420 kilometers downstream. Center Dam, 40 meters tall, built in 1925. The flood arrives roughly 1 day after breach. Center is overtopped by 7 meters. It fails. But Center is not just a dam. Center is the headworks for the Gezira scheme, Africa's second-largest agricultural irrigation project, feeding 8,800 square kilometers of farmland that produces cotton, wheat, and animal feed for 3.6 million people. When Center goes, the Gezira scheme goes with it. 620 kilometers downstream, Khartoum, population 6 to 7 million people. The confluence of the Blue Nile and the White Nile, the flood wave arrives in 3 to 4 days. Residential flood depths range from 3 to 15 meters, depending on the study, the modeling resolution, and the neighborhood elevation. The lower estimates are survivable. The upper estimates are not. Multiple studies project that within 6 to 10 days, the city at the confluence of two rivers becomes, in their technical language, a lake, with backpropagation flooding extending 300 kilometers up the White Nile, submerging communities that aren't even on the Blue Nile. 970 kilometers downstream, Meroe Dam. The flood crest arrives with up to 20 meters of overtopping potential. Whether Meroe survives depends on warning time and emergency spillway operations. If it holds, it buffers the wave. If it doesn't, its reservoir adds to the cascade. 22 days after the initial breach, the flood wave reaches Egypt's Aswan High Dam. Lake Nasser rises to an estimated 184 to 188 meters above sea level. Normal operating level is 175 meters. Aswan's crest sits at 196. The dam would likely survive structurally, but it would face extreme stress for months, requiring emergency spillway operations and activation of the Toshka Canal overflow system. The combined flood volume from cascading failures could reach 95 to 98 billion cubic meters. GERD 74, plus the contents of failed downstream dams, plus the regular seasonal flow of the Blue Nile. For scale, GERD's reservoir is 150 times larger than China's Banqiao Dam. Banqiao failed in 1975. The official death toll is 26,000. Revised estimates range from 85,000 to 240,000. It remains the deadliest dam disaster in human history. A GERD saddle dam failure would be unprecedented. There is no historical parallel. Important caveats. No study predicts imminent failure. Breach parameters, digital elevation models, and flow resistance coefficients all significantly affect results. Which is why Khartoum flood depth estimates range from 3 to nearly 35 meters across different studies. Most breach modeling has been conducted by Egyptian-affiliated researchers, and the GERD is deeply politicized between three nations. Ethiopia disputes these scenarios entirely. But the physics doesn't negotiate, and the 20 million people downstream don't get to choose which study is correct. In Khartoum right now, before any dam failure, before any flood, the water is already poison. Sudan's civil war, raging since April 2023, has collapsed the city's infrastructure. The water treatment plants are damaged or offline. Residents dig wells by hand in their courtyards. The water that comes up is cloudy, gray, thick with salt and sediment. Sometimes there are worms in it. A single barrel costs 20,000 Sudanese pounds, more than most families can afford. Cholera spread across the country through 2025. The United Nations estimates 26 million Sudanese need urgent humanitarian assistance. 6 to 7 million people live in Khartoum, at the exact point where the Blue Nile meets the White Nile, downstream of a dam showing measurable distress in a city already unable to deliver clean drinking water. In the Benishangul Gumuz region upstream, the land the reservoir now covers, more than 20,000 indigenous Gumuz farmers were displaced. Research from the University of Manchester documented inadequate compensation, destroyed livelihoods, shattered social ties, and resettlement to land that bears no resemblance to the riverine environment their culture was built around. Some resettlement centers still have no electricity. The power lines run along the roads built to service the dam. They pass right by. There's no binding agreement between Ethiopia, Sudan, and Egypt on how the GERD operates during droughts. 13 years of negotiations have produced nothing. U.S. brokered talks failed. African Union mediation ended in deadlock. The UN Security Council issued a statement calling for resumed negotiations in September 2021. 4 bilateral rounds in 2023 and 2024 yielded nothing. In December 2025, Egypt's foreign minister called the GERD illegitimate and illegal and declared negotiations a dead end. In January 2026, Donald Trump posted on Truth Social offering to restart mediation, warning against major military conflict. Egypt has signed a security pact with Somalia, deployed troops there, developed port agreements with Djibouti and Eritrea, and sent warplanes to support Sudan's military, moves widely interpreted as pressure tactics encircling Ethiopia. Analysts assess that direct military action against the completed full dam is politically and militarily infeasible. The dam is full. You cannot bomb a dam holding 74 billion cubic meters without triggering the very catastrophe you claim to be preventing. So the dam stands full, generating power from 6 of 13 turbines, showing 40 millimeters of differential settlement on a 5-kilometer saddle dam that holds 89% of live storage. Losing billions of cubic meters through fractured geology, experiencing increasing seismicity along the fault lines beneath its foundations, with no independent safety evaluation completed, no internal monitoring data released, no binding agreement on operations, no diplomatic resolution in sight. Dr. Hesham El Askari, the lead author of the 2026 study, said it as carefully as a scientist can. These findings do not predict imminent failure, but they do identify measurable warning signals that require urgent international attention and transparent safety evaluation. That evaluation has not happened. The data remains classified. The negotiations remain dead. The 20 million people downstream remain where they are. The cracks in the saddle dam are measured in millimeters. The water lost underground is measured in billions of cubic meters. The distance between a warning signal and a catastrophe is measured in transparency, in whether anyone with the authority to inspect this structure is allowed to do so. Right now, the answer is no. The clock is still running, the settlement is still growing, and the Blue Nile is still rising behind a 5-kilometer wall of rock that an international panel of experts said 13 years ago was built on the wrong foundation. Nobody listened then. The satellites are listening now. If this is the kind of engineering story you came here for, the real data behind the official story, subscribe. We cover the infrastructure failures that nobody else is willing to explain at the level they deserve. If you've ever worked on a project where the warnings were ignored and the build continued anyway, put it in the comments. You'd be surprised how many people in this audience have the same story. We'll see you on the next one.